William is perhaps best known because of a principle that has been referred to as Occam's razor. Now, he didn't invent this principle. Other people have talked about it. But he's the one who really popularizes it, and is why a lot of people connected to it. As one source puts it, it's a razor because it shaves away unnecessary assumptions. Put simply, Occam's razor is the simplest explanation is the best one. Now, essentially what he's suggesting by this is that often as people would try to explain things like knowledge, things like reality, universals, and concepts, there would be this invention of a plurality of assumptions or plurality of beings. There's not a need for that, says Occam. Right? Plurality should not be assumed without necessity. Unless there's a reason to believe in multiple causes or multiple beings, there's no reason to assume more than one. And so one does not need to posit the existence of anything not necessary. So if it's necessary to the argument, that's fine, but if it's not, you don't need to assume it. Now, some would later use Occam's razor to question the existence of God. Why assume that a being exists when something can be explained naturally, for example? But Occam believed in God. However, reason had its limitations. Unlike Aquinas and even Duns Scotus, he believed that reason could not prove God's existence. We know God is there because the church has taught us so. Well, that's not very, how can we be sure about that, right? Because somebody told me so. Ultimately, though, he said the existence of God must be accepted by faith. And reason can only take you so far. He also, connected with this, made a distinction between what he called the absolute power of God and the ordered power of God. Now, ultimately, nothing is above the absolute power of God. Whatever God pleases to do is possible. However, God also acts reasonably, which is the ordered power of God. So absolute power is God can do whatever he wants. The ordered power is God must act within reason. So we shouldn't say God always does what is good. But we should say for William, whatever God does is good, no matter what it might be. And so instead of there being a concept of good that exists prior to and separate from God, God determines what is good. Something is good not because it is good. It is good because God has determined it to be good. Questions about scholasticism? We've already touched on salvation and justification, but again, because of its importance in this latter period as we move into the Reformation, I want to just mention a couple of things that I think are important in looking ahead. For the Via Moderna, very important in talking about salvation and being made right with God was the concept of covenant. Now, essentially what's going on here is as political theory is developing and economic theory is developing, that is influencing how people are talking about salvation as well. And so the agreement between a king and his people, or noble and serfs, is shaping how people are thinking about the relationship between God and human beings. In many respects, Marx is kind of right on this. Karl Marx, of course, said the way we conceptualize God is shaped by the relationship between master and servant, employer and employee, and used that to try and argue that religion is simply projecting that relationship into the heavens and claiming that God exists. And so for Marx, religion was just a means to make sure the lower classes served the higher classes. I wouldn't go that route. But what I would say is, often economic realities have shaped how people have thought about God. That has nothing to do with whether God exists or not. It has to do with the way we talk about God. And here's an example where we can see that. That as people are thinking differently politically and economically, they're talking about God differently as well. So they're talking about the obligation God has to his people and the people's obligation to God. Now, unlike in some cases where this relationship can be negotiated, if you're negotiating with a king or an old person, God unilaterally decides these are the conditions. He makes the conditions, it's not a negotiation. But it was the covenant for a lot of these thinkers that established the conditions for justification. And in this understanding, if an individual fulfills certain demands, God has ordained to save the individual. It's almost as if we do what God tells us to do, he must save us. Not that he chooses to, not that he does so out of love, but because we have fulfilled our side of the bargain, he must save us. So an individual is expected to do her his best. When people do what they are able to do, God is obliged to accept them. That's his end of the covenant. Our end of the covenant is rejecting evil and trying to do good. Now, a lot of people heard this kind of language and said, well, this is kind of Pelagian. Because essentially you are saying human works obligate God to reward you. You're not saved by grace, you're saved by works. Which largely was not what the theologians of the Via Moderna were saying. So to avoid that Pelagian label, they brought in ideas from economics. Coins, for example. Coins becoming used as part of currency. Well, they had been used for a long time, but coins are changing. Coins were silver or gold, and so coins have been around for a long time. But what began to happen in the later part of Europe was if the king needed the gold or the silver, he would issue lead coins to replace the gold or silver ones. The expectation was that after this financial crisis that leads to him needing this, the gold and silver would be returned. The lead, of course, has little to no value, except the common agreement to consider them valuable, because they stood in for gold or silver. That's essentially how our money works. The paper that our money is printed on has no value except what we agree on. Now, it used to be it was backed by gold, in that a dollar bill was backed by $1 worth of gold. That's not the case anymore. But essentially it's the same kind of idea. The lead has no value except the expectation that the king is eventually going to change that back to gold or silver once the crisis is over. Human works, for the Via Moderna theologians, are like lead coins. So we can't save ourselves. There's no intrinsic value to our good works except the value that God agrees to impute to them because of the covenant. Right, so we're not saved by our works. They're not arguing Pelagianism, but instead, he will consider our works of greater value than what they truly are worth because of the covenant. That doesn't mean, however, there weren't people calling for changes in thinking about salvation, justification, and other doctrines as well. So there was a lot of push for reform that comes out of all of this. I want to talk about two important reformers related to that. The first is John Wycliffe. There's not much known about Wycliffe's early life. There are apparently others that shared his name around the same time period, and so sometimes scholars have had difficulty trying to determine which is the guy that we talk about who's very important and which is some other guy that is named the same. Right? So it makes it difficult to try to pin anything down. Apparently born in England, at some point he is educated in Oxford, later taught there as well, becomes a very important theologian, and eventually a priest. It's claimed that he wrote over 200 books in Latin, so becomes very prolific as an author as well. It is his writings that begin to get him in trouble. One of his earliest is a work called The Last Age of the Church, written in the aftermath of an outbreak of bubonic plague. Essentially, Wycliffe begins to believe that the end of the 14th century was essentially the end of the world. The reason the Black Death was happening was due to unworthy clergy. The church was not a place where there were priests and bishops who were serving God. Especially as the clergy died, which they did in huge numbers, as we talked about earlier, they were replaced with uneducated and unworthy individuals. So early on in his writing, he is already condemning some aspects of the Roman Church, but then becomes more concerned about Rome's power in England, where people were being forced to pay taxes to the Roman bishop. And even the clergy was protesting this, and the government agreed as well. He is sent with a bishop to discuss the issue with representatives of the Pope, and that doesn't end favorably. So he begins to write more. He attacks simony, indulgences, the authority that clergy exerted in the temporal sphere, right, in politics. Eventually writing a rather famous work is on civil dominion, essentially arguing against the influence of the clergy in the temporal sphere. Any power that overextends itself is usurping authority. The church cannot go beyond spiritual matters for Wycliffe. Jesus came to serve, not to be served. And so the church should serve the state. In this, he also encourages the crown to reduce the amount of church land, to take away some of the church's wealth and power. The church had ultimately fallen into a life of sin and needed to adopt a life of poverty for reform to take place. What he begins to do, though, is to begin to develop an ecclesiology of the church that presents the church as something different than what it had been before. By this point, a lot of how people thought about the church was related to the hierarchy, and the Pope, the levels, cardinals, the archbishops, the bishops. That's the church, the institutional church. But for Wycliffe, no, the church is the invisible body of those predestined to salvation. There are three parts to the church. There is the church triumphant, the church in heaven, those that have already passed through this life and are receiving their reward in heaven. There's the church dormant, which is the church in purgatory, those that are working through their sins but headed to heaven. And then finally on earth is the church militant, which he doesn't necessarily mean militancy, but that's part of it. But the church militant on earth contains both wheat and weeds. Some are children of God, some are children of the evil one. And no one could really be sure on earth which one of those a person was. Participating in the institutional church as a priest or a bishop, holding a church office, didn't make you part of the invisible body. Ultimately, the indicators of knowing whether someone was predestined or not to be elected to the church was the fruit that they produced. And so for Wycliffe, the Pope himself may not even be part of the true church. toward the end of his life, he rejected the papacy entirely.